Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
The Black Death was easily one of the worst tragedies to ever hit our planet, killing tens of millions. And frankly, also in many ways bringing out the worst that human nature has to offer. Today, we're going to compare that to the COVID-19 pandemic, not because of the death toll, which is nothing like the devastation of the 14th century. Instead, we're going to look at some disturbing parallels that might have a lot to say about the way that you and I are wired as human beings.
Welcome to Authentic. Sean Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Sean with this week's episode of Authentic.
They called it the bubonic plague because of one of the first symptoms that would show up. Swollen lymph glands, or buboes they called them, which would erupt at the spot where a flea bit you and manage to transmit the deadly bacteria through your skin. About 7 days after that initial bite, you would get symptoms like fever, headache, and vomiting, the same kinds of things you might get from the flu. But then 3 days after that, an alarming number of victims were dead. In the south of Europe, say in countries like Spain or Italy, as much as 80% of the population died, while Northern Europe lost something like 20%, which only seems like a good number next to 80%. And of course, if we were to lose 20% of the population in a pandemic, we would be devastated. I mean, here in my home state of Colorado, we lost something like 0.1% to COVID-19. At least that's what the number was this morning when I came into the studio. And of course, we found that incredibly tragic because it means that just about everybody knows somebody who died from COVID. So imagine a disease that suddenly takes out 1 in 5 people. And you get a sense of the magnitude of the bubonic plague even in the less affected areas. The cities of Paris and London each lost about half of their population. And that's because densely populated urban centers usually fare more poorly than the countryside when exposed to highly contagious diseases. You see the same effect in New York City, where an incredibly dense population meant that COVID hit them particularly hard. Of course, there really is no comparison between the Black Death and COVID, at least in terms of death toll. But there is a lot of similarity when it comes to the way that people responded. And I guess I want to look at that for a little bit today, because I think it offers us a glimpse into human nature that might prove very useful in figuring out how you and I might like to conduct ourselves. And fortunately, because the 14th century was a time when literature and art were starting to flourish, we have some vivid accounts of what the world was like in the face of the plague. In particular, we have books like this one, The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, which was first published in 1352. And it's a book I wouldn't recommend leaving around the house for your kids to find because it's, well, rather blunt when it comes to describing the morals or the lack of morals in Western Europe at the time. It delivers a particularly rough assessment of medieval clergy, many of whom, as you know, were living very decadently back then. A fact that eventually helped spark the Protestant Reformation. And it really demonstrates that the problems that led to the rise of Martin Luther were a very long time in the making. In fact, there's one section in this book where a wealthy Christian merchant is trying to convince a Jewish friend named Abraham to convert. And after quite a bit of discussion, Abraham is tempted to make the leap. But he decides that before he converts to Christianity, he should visit the city of Rome to have a look around, so he can see for himself what the Bishop of Rome was really like. Would the Bishop of Rome prove to be a model human being? If the fruit of the Christian religion was better than his own faith, Abraham said, he would consider becoming a Christian. But if it wasn't, he would rather remain a Jew. And it's at this point that his Christian friend suddenly becomes very discouraged because he knows full well what Abraham is going to discover when he gets to the eternal city of the 14th century. He's going to find an alarming amount of corruption and immorality. Here's how Boccaccio puts it in his book. He writes, when Gennaro, that's the wealthy merchant, when Gennaro heard this, he was stricken with a deep sadness. I've lost all the pains that I thought were so well taken, he said to himself. I think I've converted him, and yet if he goes to the court of Rome and sees the wicked and filthy lives of the clergy, not only won't he change from a Jew into a Christian, But if he had already become a Christian, he would without fail go back to being a Jew again. I don't know if you've ever felt embarrassment over some of the public behavior of notable Christians, but I actually felt something when I read that account. And it's hardly a ringing endorsement of the medieval church. And it's exactly what Luther would still find about 170 years later on his infamous visit to Rome. An incredibly corrupt church. I mean, we may as well admit it. Western Christians had a serious problem in the medieval period. And what this tells us is that the sorry condition of the Western church was a long time in the making. And even worse, it was widely known, which we can see from the writings of a few brave people who were actually willing to put their objections in writing. Now, personally, I have to wonder, if the printing press had been invented before Boccaccio wrote this, maybe the Reformation might have gotten off the ground just a little bit sooner. But of course, I'm getting a little bit off topic because we started out by discussing the Black Death. So maybe I need to put the Reformation aside for a moment and come back to it some other day so we can take a look at some of the early forerunners here who paved the way for Luther. What's important for today is the fact that Boccaccio wrote this book during a global pandemic. And it's a series of stories being told by 10 people who have fled to the countryside to escape the ravages of disease. It gives us some first-hand insight into what the plague must have been like. And I guess the reason I want you to see this is because it demonstrates that human nature really hasn't changed much over the last 700 years. For the most part, human beings are always going to be human beings. And the way we deal with things like anxiety and fear says a lot about who and what we are. So let's take a look at how some people responded to the horrible horror of a disease that only gave you 3 days to live. Boccaccio writes, almost all of whom took one utterly cruel precaution, namely to avoid the sick and their belongings, fleeing far away from them, for in doing so they all thought they could preserve their own health. Now, don't forget, this is a long time before germ theory, so people don't really understand exactly how disease is spread, but they're smart enough to realize that being in the vicinity of sick people is a bad idea, and their basic survival instinct suddenly kicks in, and now it's every man for himself. It continues, and here's where it starts to get interesting. He writes, some people were of the opinion that living moderately and being abstemious would really help them resist the disease. They therefore formed themselves into companies and lived in isolation from everyone else. Having come together, they shut themselves up inside houses where no one was sick, and they had ample means to live well, so that while avoiding overindulgence, they still enjoyed the most delicate foods and the best wines in moderation. They would not speak with anyone from outside, nor did they want to hear any news about the dead and the dying, and instead they passed their time playing music and enjoying whatever other amusements they could devise. So what they essentially did, in addition to just ignoring the pandemic, was self-isolate and keep their lifestyle simple, making sure they didn't punish their bodies with licentiousness. They practiced moderation. And I guess that's interesting because here in the 21st century, we did find that people whose health was already compromised with lifestyle diseases were the ones who seemed most likely to succumb to COVID-19. I mean, not exclusively so by any means, but there was a trend. And so it appears there might be something to be said for a temperate lifestyle that chooses to forgo excess. Things like simple diet, simple habits, something you do find in the pages of the Bible. Well, it turns out it's a pretty good approach for bettering your odds in the face of disease. Is it a guarantee? No, absolutely not, because everybody eventually dies, but it does seem to better your odds. Now, I've got to take a really quick break, so I'm going to self-isolate right here in the studio for just a few seconds, and then I'll come back to show you what else we can learn from the Bible and the bubonic plague.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. Sign up at BibleStudies.com today and start your journey of discovery.
This is Authentic with Sean Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
One of the interesting things about these people who chose to isolate themselves during the Black Death is the way they kind of instinctively understood the principle of quarantine. If you isolate infected people from non-infected people, it effectively slows the spread of the disease. And it turns out the word quarantine actually comes to us courtesy of the bubonic plague. At the height of the pandemic, sailors arriving in Venice were required to drop anchor and stay on their ships for 40 days to be sure they weren't infected. And in Italian, 40 days is 40 giorni, or quarantine. So here we are, 700 years after the fact, still applying the lessons of the plague to our own experience with a pandemic. But what's really interesting is how the concept of quarantine actually dates back thousands of years before that, and we find it in the pages of the Bible, where the children of Israel practiced some rather stringent health principles. I'll show you what I mean. This is dealing with the disease of leprosy, which, fortunately, is not as much of a problem now as it was back then. Anybody suspected of having this horrible disease was immediately isolated, and in Leviticus chapter 13, we find a description of what they did. If somebody was obviously infected, they had to leave right away. But if somebody might have the disease, then the priest would inspect them. And here's how that went. Leviticus 13. But if the bright spot is white on the skin of his body and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and its hair has not turned white, then the priest shall isolate the one who has the sore 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day, and indeed, if the sore appears to be as it was, and the sore is not spread on the skin, then the priest shall isolate him another 7 days. So what they were doing was using an abundance of caution. If someone was suspected of carrying this disease, they were isolated for a week at a time until everybody could be certain. And if the poor victim did prove to be infected, then they were permanently exiled because there was no cure for leprosy. It was a death sentence. This was an early version of quarantine, and it's still the way we deal with infectious diseases today. For example, when someone gets exposed to COVID-19, we make them go home and keep away from everybody else until we know for sure. Now, the other thing I want you to notice is how these same people who were self-isolating back in the 14th century decided that they should keep their diets and lifestyles simple so that they didn't tax their immune systems. Of course, they didn't really know about immune systems per se back then, but that's how we would describe what they were doing. And I guess what I find really interesting is the way that in recent years, something known as the Daniel diet has become really popular, at least it was for a while. It's a fad that got started in a big way when a well-known American pastor noticed how many of the people he was baptizing were overweight. And of course, globally, Americans unfortunately do have the reputation of being, well, a little corpulent. So, you might remember how popular news outlets were running stories on the benefits of this biblical diet, designed to help you lose weight and achieve a better degree of health. And this diet is based on a passage in Daniel chapter 1, where a group of Hebrew captives suddenly found themselves living in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, which means they were exposed to the decadent lifestyles of the Babylonians, which included food that was offered to idols, a big no-no for Jews, and an overly indulgent variety of very rich food. So, Daniel and his friends asked to be put on a very simple diet. This comes from Daniel 1 verse 5. It says, "And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king." So, what many people have noticed is that this is a little like our typical Western diet, which is full of things that used to be the occasional treat and not the main course. So Daniel and his friends make this request, which you find in verse 12. "Please," he says, "test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants." And of course, by the end of the story, these young Hebrew captives proved to be healthier and smarter than everyone else who worked for the king. And what many people discovered when they started mimicking this diet in recent years is that they started losing weight and their health improved. Now, I don't know how much thought these people back in the 14th century put into this, but at the height of the bubonic plague, there was a group of people who practiced self-isolation and adopted a temperate lifestyle. Now, unfortunately, Boccaccio doesn't tell us whether or not they fared better than everybody else, but common sense and medical research kind of suggests they probably did. And then Boccaccio mentions a second response to the plague, which we also saw over the course of our own somewhat less severe pandemic. He writes this: "Others, holding the contrary opinion, maintain that the surest medicine for such an evil disease was to drink heavily, enjoy life's pleasures, and go about singing and having fun, satisfying their appetites by any means available, while laughing at everything and turning whatever happened into a joke. Moreover, they practiced what they preached to the best of their ability, for they went from one tavern to another, drinking to excess both day and night. They did their drinking more freely in private homes." So, in other words, these people were pretending that nothing was wrong. And they went out partying in the abandoned homes they found all over the place. And these were probably homes vacated by death. These people chose to live it up. And again, Boccaccio doesn't provide us with an outcome, but given the severity of the plague, this probably wasn't the smartest approach. Now, let me push the pause button here for a minute so I can give you just a little bit of a disclaimer, because unfortunately today, with the COVID-19 pandemic, the whole thing has become very politicized. And no matter what I say next, somebody's going to get their nose out of joint and think that I'm taking a political position. So let me state for the record, that is not what I'm doing. Please don't waste your energy writing me letters. I think there's enough of that going on during this pandemic already. Personally, I think we've come to a rather sad state of affairs here in the West, where nobody can say anything or take an objective look at any subject without somebody losing their cool and making the whole thing political. So here it is for the record. I am not a Democrat. I am not a Republican. And all I'm trying to do is examine the way that human beings tend to respond to a crisis. Now, I've got to take another short break, but when I come back, I'm going to show you how the very act of politicizing a health crisis is also part of how this almost always plays out. I'll be right back.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages. Your whole family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon. Check it out today at discoverymountain.com.
This is Authentic with Sean Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Well, look at that. We are back from the break. And we've been looking at the writings of a 14th century Italian author, Giovanni Boccaccio, who was on the ground during the plague and gives us a sense of how people dealt with that crisis. And one of the more unfortunate observations he makes is the way that people just stopped caring about each other. Here's what he writes. "And leaving aside the fact that the citizens avoided one another, that almost no one took care of his neighbors, and that relatives visited one another infrequently, if ever, and always kept their distance, the tribulation of the plague had put such fear into the hearts of men and women that brothers abandoned their brothers, uncles their nephews, sisters their brothers, and very often wives their husbands. In fact, what is even worse, and almost unbelievable, is that fathers and mothers refused to tend to their children and take care of them, treating them as if they belonged to someone else." Now, of course, on the one hand, you can kind of understand this. People were contagious and you didn't want to get too close, not even to relatives. And on top of that, our natural fallen instinct is to think about ourselves first. But then on the other hand, we've all been witnessing how little it really takes to erode our sense of civility. Here in the 21st century, I've been a little alarmed at the way basic decency seems to be falling apart, regardless of the pandemic. In many ways, it feels like Jesus got it absolutely right when he looked into the future and said, "Many will be offended and betray one another and will hate one another. Because of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold." Now, speaking of lawlessness, Boccaccio also tells us that as the plague got worse and worse, people began to abandon any sense of the law. And by that he meant both secular and religious laws. Here's how he describes it. "In the midst of so much affliction and misery in our city, the respect for the reverend authority of the laws, both divine and human, had declined just about to the vanishing point. For like everyone else, their officers and executors, who were not dead or sick themselves, had so few personnel that they could not fulfill their duties. Thus, people felt free to behave however they liked. Now, here's why I find this so important. There's no question that COVID-19 took a toll on our planet, and as of right now, as I'm sitting here, we're still not out of the woods quite yet. Millions of people lost their jobs. Millions globally lost their lives. And here in the West, we saw actual scarcity in the supermarket. I mean, we were running out of basic things like toilet paper and cleaning supplies. I remember going into Safeway and finding no produce. I mean, absolutely none. Now, in other parts of the world, they laugh at that. That's just the way things are. But here in the West, we suddenly realize just how fragile civilization can be. And what really brings this all into focus is the way the Bible describes a coming crisis, coupled with the way Paul describes the generation who will be here when it happens. He writes this, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power." Now, I know there are people who laugh at the prophetic parts of the Bible because they can't for the life of them understand how some of the catastrophic conditions described here could possibly happen to us. But look at the last couple of years and ask yourselves, is this really all that impossible? What if COVID-19 had been worse? What if it had been as bad as the plague? I mean, it took so little to make us start hoarding, and it took so little to bring out the worst in people. So you've got to wonder, is Paul's prediction really impossible? I'm going to argue it's not. And now I want to return to the fact that the COVID pandemic was so quickly politicized. And some people in this already polarized society use this crisis to try and divide people further. Whenever something really bad happens, one of the first things we always seem to want is a scapegoat. We want somebody to blame. And that's exactly what happened in the 14th century, when people were struggling to understand why this horrible outbreak was happening. In his brilliant book on the philosophical and historical influences that fueled the Renaissance and the Reformation, Thomas Cahill makes an important observation about the way that people tried to explain it. Wherever the plague struck, he writes, waves of accusation and intolerance seemed to strike in its wake. Sinners were responsible, or heretics, or foreigners, or beggars, or lepers, whoever was other. None suffered more from these waves than communities of Jews. In early 1349, the Jews of Strasbourg were slaughtered. Later that year, all the Jews of Mainz and Cologne. By 1351, more than 200 Jewish towns and urban neighborhoods across Europe had been obliterated. Take just a short trip through the pages of history, and you'll see this again and again and again and again. When something really bad happens, most of us want to blame someone, and then sometimes innocent people begin to die. Back in the 14th century, it seems like the Jews took the brunt of Europe's frustration, and all the pretense of civility suddenly evaporated as they were slaughtered for their supposed role in the pandemic. So you've got to wonder, what exactly would stop our generation from doing the same thing? In recent memory, we've already seen the Holocaust, where a number of minorities were made to carry the blame for the political and economic woes of a majority. And from what I read in the pages of history and what I read in the pages of the Bible, I have little doubt that it's going to happen again. In fact, let me show you just one short passage that should arrest everybody's attention. We've already kind of peeked at it. You should pay attention if you've been contemplating the way that we've handled ourselves during the pandemic. This is over in Matthew chapter 24, starting in verse 10. It's the words of Jesus. "And then many will be offended, and will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold." Now, some people think that could never happen to us. But in the 2,000 years since that was written down, we've already seen it happen on a tragic scale many times. From the scapegoating of Christians by the Romans, to the horrors of the Inquisition, to the scapegoating of Jews and other people deemed to be religious heretics during the plague. You know, interestingly, A lot of students of prophecy are actually convinced that the bubonic plague was also predicted in the Bible, but we'll have to look at that some other day. Okay, time for one last break, and then I'll be right back.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Voice of Prophecy's free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the prophetic mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and the world around you. You can study online or request them by mail. Visit BibleStudies.com and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Sean Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Unfortunately, the way human nature appears to work is this. You and I don't suddenly build good quality character in the face of a major crisis. The writer James Allen once said, "Adversity does not build character, it reveals it." And history suggests he was absolutely right. So the time to figure out how you're going to respond, who you're going to be in the next crisis, and believe me, there will be a next crisis. The time to determine how you're going to respond, what kind of human being you're going to be, that's right now. If the Apostle Paul was right, and I'm absolutely convinced he was, then the world right now is building exactly the wrong character for the problems that lie just ahead. So I guess this is my challenge for you. It seems like human nature never changes. And here in the Bible we have a book that offers profound insight into how the human race is actually wired. And it offers us a stunning alternative, a different way to live, a way to face any crisis and still be an authentic human, still reflect the authentic image of God. What happened over the last couple of years has absolutely happened before. And yes, it's absolutely going to happen again. And eventually, the Bible says, this is going to be on a scale that few people can actually comprehend. So maybe, just maybe, it's time to gather some age-old wisdom from a very old book. And we need to do it now, when there's still time to make what this book teaches, written by the Creator, an authentic part of who you are. This book has wisdom that has never been wrong about life on planet Earth, not even once. Not only does it see what's coming down the pike, not only has it been right about everything that it's predicted, it's been essentially correct about who you and I are without God. We can be different. We can set a shining light in this world that is polarized, filled with hate, people acting irresponsibly. We can reflect the image of God and live an authentic human life. I'm Sean Boonstra. Thanks for joining me today. You've been watching Authentic.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.